L'Orfeo, sometimes called La Favola d'Orfeo, is a late Renaissance, early Baroque favola in musica or opera, by Claudio Monteverdi, with a libretto by Alessandro Striggio. It is based on the Greek legend of Orpheus, and tells the story of his descent to Hades and his fruitless attempt to bring his dead bride Eurydice back to the living world. It was written in 1607 for a court performance during the annual Carnival at Mantua, while Jacopo Peri's Dafne is generally recognized as the first work in the opera genre, and the earliest surviving opera is Peri's Eurydice. L'Orfeo is the earliest that is still regularly performed. By the early 17th century, the traditional intermedio, a musical sequence between the acts of a straight play, was evolving into the form of a complete musical drama or opera. Monteverdi's L'Orfeo moved this process out of its experimental era and provided the first fully developed example of the new genre. After its initial performance, the work was staged again in Mantua, and possibly in other Italian centers in the next few years. Its score was published by Monteverdi in 1609 and again in 1615. After the composer's death in 1643, the opera went unperformed for many years, and was largely forgotten until a revival of interest in the late 19th century led to a spate of modern editions and performances. At first, these performances tended to be concert versions within institutes and music societies, but following the first modern dramatized performance in Paris in 1911, the work began to be seen in theaters. After the Second World War, many recordings were issued, and the opera was increasingly staged in opera houses, although some leading venues resisted it. In 2007, the quattercentenary of the premiere was celebrated by performances throughout the world. In his published score, Monteverdi lists around 41 instruments to be deployed, with distinct groups of instruments used to depict particular scenes and characters. Thus, strings, harpsichords and recorders represent the pastoral fields of Thrace with the nymphs and shepherds, while heavy brass illustrates the underworld and its denizens. Composed at the point of transition from the Renaissance era to the Baroque, L'Orfeo employs all the resources then known within the art of music, with particularly daring use of polyphony. The work is not orchestrated as such. In the Renaissance tradition, instrumentalists followed the composer's general instructions but were given considerable freedom to improvise. Historical background: Claudio Monteverdi, born in Cremona in 1567, was a musical prodigy who studied under Marci Antonio Ingegneri, the maestro di cappella at Cremona Cathedral. After training in singing, strings playing and composition, Monteverdi worked as a musician in Verona and Milan until, in 1590 or 1591, he secured a post as suonator di viola at Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga's court at Mantua. Through ability and hard work, Monteverdi rose to become Gonzaga's maestro della musica in 1601. Vincenzo Gonzaga's particular passion for musical theatre and spectacle grew from his family connections with the court of Florence. Towards the end of the 16th century, innovative Florentine musicians were developing the intermedio, a long-established form of musical interlude, inserted between the acts of spoken dramas, into increasingly elaborate forms, led by Jacopo Corsi. These successes to the renowned camerata were responsible for the first work generally recognized as belonging to the genre of opera, Dafne, composed by Corsi and Jacopo Peri, and performed in Florence in 1598. This work combined elements of madrigal singing and monody with dancing and instrumental passages to form a dramatic whole. Only fragments of its music still exist, but several other Florentine works of the same period, Rappresentation di Anima, e di Corpo by Emilio da Cavaliere, Peri's Eurydice and Giulio Caccini's identically titled Eurydice, survive complete. These last two works were the first of many musical representations of the Orpheus myth as recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and as such were direct precursors of Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. The Gonzaga court had a long history of promoting dramatic entertainment. A century before Duke Vincenzo's time, the court had staged Angelo Poliziano's lyrical drama La Favola di Orfeo, at least half of which was sung rather than spoken. More recently, in 1598, Monteverdi had helped the court's musical establishment produce Giovanni Battista Guarini's play Il Pastifido, described by theatre historian Mark Ringer as a watershed theatrical work, which inspired the Italian craze for pastoral drama. On 6 October 1600, while visiting Florence for the wedding of Maria de' Medici to King Henry IV of France, Duke Vincenzo attended a production of Peri's Eurydice. It is likely that his principal musicians, including Monteverdi, were also present at this performance. The Duke quickly recognized the novelty of this new form of dramatic entertainment, and its potential for bringing prestige to those prepared to sponsor it. Creation. Libretto. Among those present at the Eurydice performance in October 1600 was a young lawyer and career diplomat from Gonzaga's court, Alessandro Striggio, son of a well-known composer of the same name. The younger Striggio was himself a talented musician. As a 16-year-old, he had played the viol at the wedding festivities of Duke Ferdinando of Tuscany in 1589. Together with Duke Vincent's two young sons, Francesco and Fernandino, he was a member of Mantua's exclusive intellectual society, the Accademia degli Inverhiti, which provided the chief outlet for the city's theatrical works. It is not clear at what point Striggio began his libretto for L'Orfeo, but work was evidently underway in January 1607. In a letter written on 5 January, Francesco Gonzaga asks his brother, then attached to the Florentine court, to obtain the services of a high-quality castrato from the Grand Duke's establishment, for a play in music being prepared for the Mantuan Carnival. Striggio's main sources for his libretto were Books 10 and 11 of Ovid's Metamorphoses and Book 4 of Virgil's Georgics. These provided him with the basic material, but not the structure for a staged drama. The events of Acts Chapter 1 and 2 of the libretto are covered by a mere 13 lines in the Metamorphoses. To help in creating a dramatic form, Striggio drew on other sources: Poliziano's 1480 play, Guarini's Il Pastifido, and Ottavio Rinuccini's libretto for Peri's Eurydice. Musicologist Gary Tomlinson remarks on the many similarities between Striggio's and Rinuccini's texts, noting that some of the speeches in L'Orfeo correspond closely in content and even in locution to the counterparts in Eurydice. The critic Barbara Rossano-Hanning writes that Striggio's verses are less subtle than those of Rinuccini, although the structure of Striggio's libretto is more interesting. Rinuccini, whose work had been written for the festivities accompanying a Medici wedding, was obliged to alter the myth to provide a happy ending suitable for the occasion. By contrast, because Striggio was not writing for a formal court celebration, he could be more faithful to the spirit of the myth's conclusion, in which Orfeo is killed and dismembered by deranged man trianads or bacchants. He chose, in fact, to write a somewhat muted version of this bloody finale, in which the bacchants threaten Orpheus' destruction but his actual fate is left in doubt. The libretto was published in Mantua in 1607 to coincide with the premiere. Incorporates Striggio's ambiguous ending. However, Monteverdi's score published in Venice in 1609 by Ricciardo Amadino shows an entirely different resolution, with Orpheus transported to the heavens through the intervention of Apollo. According to Ringer, Striggio's original ending was almost certainly used at the opera's premiere, but there is no doubt that Monteverdi believed the revised ending was aesthetically correct. The musicologist Nino Pirotta argues that the Apollo ending was part of the original plan for the work, but was not staged at the premiere because the small room which hosted the event could not contain the theatrical machinery that this ending required. The Bacchants scene was a substitution. Monteverdi's intentions were restored when this constraint was removed. Composition. When Monteverdi composed L'Orfeo, he had a thorough grounding in theatrical music. He had been employed at the Gonzaga court for 16 years, much of it as a performer or arranger of stage music, and in 1604 he had written the Ballo gli Amori di Diane ed Endymione for the 1604–05 Mantua Carnival. The elements from which Monteverdi constructed his first opera score, the aria, the strophic song, recitative, choruses, dances, dramatic musical interludes, were, as conductor Nicolaus Harnoncourt has pointed out, not created by him, but he blended the entire stock of newest and older possibilities into a unity that was indeed new. Musicologist Robert Donington writes similarly, contains no element which was not based on precedent, but it reaches complete maturity in that recently developed form. Here are words as directly expressed in music as wanted them expressed. Here is music expressing them, with the full inspiration of genius. Monteverdi states the orchestral requirements at the beginning of his published score, but in accordance with the practice of the day he does not specify their exact usage. At that time it was usual to allow each interpreter of the work freedom to make local decisions, based on the orchestral forces at their disposal. These could differ sharply from place to place. Furthermore, as Harnoncourt points out, the instrumentalists would all have been composers and would have expected to collaborate creatively at each performance, rather than playing a set text. Another practice of the time was to allow singers to embellish their arias. Monteverdi wrote plain and embellished versions of some arias, such as Orpheus, Presente Spiritu, but according to Harnoncourt, it is obvious that where he did not write any embellishments he did not want any sung. Each act of the opera deals with a single element of the story, and each ends with a chorus. Despite the five-act structure, with two sets of scene changes, it is likely that L'Orfeo conformed to the standard practice for court entertainments of that time and was played as a continuous entity, without intervals or curtain descents between acts. It was the contemporary custom for scene shifts to take place in sight of the audience, these changes being reflected musically by changes in instrumentation, key and style. Instrumentation. For the purpose of analysis, the music scholar Jane Glover has divided Monteverdi's list of instruments into three main groups: strings, brass and continuo, with a few further items not easily classifiable. The strings grouping is formed from 10 members of the violin family, 2 double basses, and 2 small violins. The viola brasò are in 2 5-part ensembles, each comprising 2 violins, 2 violas and a cello. The brass group contains 4 or 5 trombones, 3 trumpets and 2 cornets. The continuo forces include 2 harpsichords, a double harp, 2 or 3 chitarras, chitarroni, 2 pipe organs, 3 bass viola da gamba, and a regal, a small reed organ. Outside of these groupings are 2 recorders, and possibly 1 or more chitins, unlisted by Monteverdi, but included in instructions relating to the end of Act 4. Instrumentally, the 2 worlds represented within the opera are distinctively portrayed. The pastoral world of the fields of Thrace is represented by the strings, harpsichords, harp organs, recorders and chitarroni. The remaining instruments, mainly brass, are associated with the underworld. Though there is not an absolute distinction, strings appear on several occasions in the Hades scenes. Within this general ordering, specific instruments or combinations are used to accompany some of the main characters: Orpheus by harp and organ, shepherds by harpsichord and chitarroni, the underworld gods by trombones and regal. All of these musical distinctions and characterizations were in accordance with the long-standing traditions of the Renaissance orchestra, of which the large L'Orfeo ensemble is typical. Monteverdi instructs his players generally to the work as simply and correctly as possible, and not with many florid passages or runs. Those playing ornamentation instruments such as strings and flutes are advised to play nobly, with much invention and variety, but are warned against overdoing it, whereby nothing is heard but chaos and confusion, offensive to the listener. Since at no time are all the instruments played together, the number of players needed is less than the number of instruments. Harnoncourt indicates that in Monteverdi's day the numbers of players and singers together, and the small rooms in which performances were held, often meant that the audience barely numbered more than the performers. Roles. In his personaggi listed in the 1609 score, Monteverdi unaccountably omits La Messaggera, and indicates that the final chorus of shepherds who perform the Miresca at the opera's end are a separate group. Little information is available about who sang the various roles in the first performance. A letter published at Mantua in 1612 records that the distinguished tenor and composer Francesco Rassi took part, and it is generally assumed that he sang the title role. Rassi could sing in both the tenor and bass ranges, with exquisite style and extraordinary feeling. The involvement in the premiere of a Florentine castrato, Giovanni Gualberto Mali, is confirmed by correspondence between the Gonzaga princes. Mali sang the prologue, Proserpina, and possibly one other role, either La Messaggera or Speranza. The musicologist and historian Hans Redlich mistakenly allocates Mali to the role of Orfeo. A clue about who played Eurydice is contained in a 1608 letter to Duke Vincenzo. It refers to that little priest who performed the role of Eurydice in the Most Serene Prince's Orfeo. This priest was possibly Padre Girolamo Bacchini, a castrato known to have had connections to the Mantuan court in the early 17th century. The Monteverdi scholar Tim Carter speculates that 2 prominent Mantuan tenors, Pandolfo Grande and Francesco Campagnola, may have sung minor roles in the premiere. There are solo parts for 4 shepherds and 3 spirits. Carter calculates that through the doubling of roles that the text allows, a total of 10 singers, 3 sopranos, 2 altos, 3 tenors and 2 basses, is required for a performance, with the soloists also forming the chorus. Carter's suggested role doublings include La Musica with Eurydice, Ninfa with Proserpina, and La Messaggera with Speranza. Synopsis. The action takes place in 2 contrasting locations, the fields of Thrace and the underworld. An instrumental toccata precedes the entrance of La Musica, representing the spirit of music, who sings a prologue of 5 stanzas of verse. After a gracious welcome to the audience, she announces that she can, through sweet sounds, calm every troubled heart. Quote, She sings a further paean to the power of music, before introducing the drama's main protagonist, Orfeo, who held the wild beast spellbound with his song. After La Musica's final request for silence, the curtain rises on Act 1 to reveal a pastoral scene. Orfeo and Eurydice enter together with a chorus of nymphs and shepherds, who act in the manner of a Greek chorus, commenting on the action both as a group and as individuals. A shepherd announces that this is the couple's wedding day. The chorus responds, first in a stately invocation and then in a joyful dance. Orfeo and Eurydice sing of the love for each other before leaving with most of the group for the wedding ceremony in the temple. Those left on stage sing a brief chorus, commenting on how Orfeo used to be one for whom sighs were food and weeping was drink, before love brought him to a state of sublime happiness. Orfeo returns with the main chorus, and sings with them of the beauties of nature. Orfeo then muses on his former unhappiness, but proclaims, after grief one is more content, after pain one is happier. The mood of contentment is abruptly ended when La Messaggera enters, bringing the news that, while gathering flowers, Eurydice has received a fatal snake bite. The chorus expresses its anguish, at a happening, impious and cruel fate, while La Messaggera castigates herself as the bearing of bad tidings. Orfeo, after venting his grief and incredulity, declares his intention to descend into the underworld and persuade its ruler to allow Eurydice to return to life. Otherwise, he says, I shall remain with thee in the company of death. He departs, and the chorus resumes its lament. Orfeo is guided by Speranza to the gates of Hades. Having pointed out the words inscribed on the gate, Speranza leaves. Orfeo is now confronted with the ferryman Carante, who addresses Orfeo harshly and refuses to take him across the river Styx. Orfeo attempts to persuade Carante by singing a flattering song to him, but the ferryman is unmoved. However, when Orfeo takes up his lyre and plays, Carante is soothed into sleep. Seizing his chance, Orfeo steals the ferryman's boat and crosses the river, entering the underworld while a chorus of spirits reflects that nature cannot defend herself against man. He has tamed the sea with fragile wood, and disdained the rage of the winds. In the underworld, Proserpina, queen of Hades, who has been deeply affected by Orfeo's singing, petitions King Pluton, her husband, for Eurydice's release. Moved by her pleas, Pluton agrees on the condition that, as he leads Eurydice towards the world, Orfeo must not look back. If he does, a single glance will condemn him to eternal loss. Orfeo enters, leading Eurydice and singing confidently that on that day he will rest on his wife's white bosom. But as he sings, a note of doubt creeps in. Who will assure me that she is following? Perhaps, he thinks, Pluton, driven by envy, has imposed the condition through spite. Suddenly distracted by an off-stage commotion, Orfeo looks round. Immediately, the image of Eurydice begins to fade. She sings, despairingly, "Losest thou me through too much love," and disappears. Orfeo attempts to follow her but is drawn away by an unseen force. The chorus of spirits sings that Orfeo, having overcome Hades, was in turn overcome by his passions. Back in the fields of Thrace, Orfeo has a long soliloquy in which he laments his loss, praises Eurydice's beauty and resolves that his heart will never again be pierced by Cupid's arrow. An offstage echo repeats his final phrases. Suddenly, in a cloud, Apollo descends from the heavens and chastises him. Why dost thou give thyself up as prey to rage and grief? He invites Orfeo to leave the world and join him in the heavens, where he will recognize Eurydice's likeness in the stars. Orfeo replies that it would be unworthy not to follow the counsel of such a wise father, and together they ascend. A shepherd's chorus concludes that he who so those in suffering shall reap the fruit of every grace. Before the opera ends with a vigorous moresca. Original libretto ending. In Striggio's 1607 libretto, Orpheus Act 5 soliloquy is interrupted, not by Apollo's appearance but by a chorus of maenads of Mantua.While, drunken women, who sing of the divine fury of the master, the god Bacchus. The cause of the wrath is Orfeo and his renunciation of women. He will not escape their heavenly anger, and the longer he evades them the more severe his fate will be. Orfeo leaves the scene and his destiny is left uncertain, as the Bacchantes devote themselves for the rest of the opera to wild singing and dancing in praise of Bacchus. The early music authority Claude Palaska believes that the two endings are not incompatible. Orfeo might evade the fury of the Bacchantes and be rescued by Apollo,